Welcome to the President and CEO Focus on the Middle Market podcast series, where President and CEO founder Paul Stukel discusses middle market issues with business leaders from across the nation. Today, Paul speaks with St. Louis attorney Robert Zafft about the increasing pressure boards and CEOs are under to react to political and cultural controversies in the broader society and the pitfalls to avoid in doing so.
It's a fascinating subject. It's a subject that I've pondered considerably. The subject of, as you say, as was said in the thing that was sent to me, either by accident or design, so many CEOs and their companies get themselves embroiled in the political controversies of the day. And I think initially I'd like to focus on public companies that do this, because I think there is a distinction to be made between public and private companies from an ethical perspective. I guess, first off, the public companies, and you've identified several of them, and there's plenty more. Target, Nordstrom's, and Starbucks. The list kind of goes on and on. Apple getting involved in the North Carolina transgender bathroom quandary. It's interesting to me. What do you think drives that? We'll talk about how people can deal with that subsequently, but a lot of these are quite intentional. Certainly Nordstrom's, it sure seemed like it was pretty intentional. Now, they said it was because of Trump's, lagging sales, perhaps. But certainly Target and Starbucks and Apple, those are very defined and intentioned acts that put them into the public discussion. What do you think's driving that?
Well, I assume that the CEOs or the leaders of these companies are trying to do the right thing. And sometimes where they can cross their wires is that they confuse what they think is right personally with what is right for the company and for their shareholders. And that's where this idea of the private company versus public company divide is very stark, and that is where you have a small defined group of private shareholders. In a sense, their company can be like their alter ego ethically or morally, and we can discuss that in the context of, for example, Hobby Lobby or Chick-fil-A.
Right.
But as the companies get bigger, as their ownership gets more diverse, as they're public, I think that senior leaders have to be careful that they're not substituting their own vision of what's right and good for what is in the best interest of the company and its shareholders. I think If we take the case of Target, for example, Target back in 2010 was making a contribution to a gubernatorial candidate in its home state of Minnesota. And tangentially, this candidate, who was viewed as being pro-business and wanted to reduce sales taxes, which is great for a retailer, tangentially, he supported traditional marriage. Now, Target, by virtue of its mission and its values and its culture and its brand, has viewed itself as a progressive company. And so there was upset among people, I'll call them on the left, about Target's support for traditional marriage, and they tried to institute a boycott. Right. And fast forward to, and this is at a time, remember, in 2008, all the major political candidates of both parties were supporting traditional marriage and came out against gay marriage. So you can see how quickly the axes shift sometimes in our society, for good or for ill.
Sure.
It's just fast moving. So fast forward now to 2016, and North Carolina has passed its law with regard to bathroom access, for good or for ill, okay? And I wonder if Target didn't just say, well, we got burned last time, now we're going to make a firm statement. And they went out and they made a firm statement, and that firm statement in terms of gender fluid bathrooms and gender fluid changing room policies has ended up costing Target somewhere in the area of $10 billion of market capitalization. And
wow, I didn't know it was that big. Wow, that's extraordinary.
People can argue the numbers, but if you look at where they are compared to where they were, if you look at how they've been doing against their competitors, it was a real big chunk out of their market cap. And so one question is, was management confusing its own view of the world with the view of the world of many of its own customers, or its version of the good? Now, I'm not saying you do nothing necessarily, and in fact what I advocate to my clients, and I advocate in teaching business ethics, is something that you can do if you feel strongly about something is not necessarily take a hard position, but you can call for dialogue. I think a much wiser course of action for Target would have been to say, look, this is now an important social issue, and we feel that we need to have this discussed, and we need to come up with some form of guidelines, even self-regulatory guidelines or policies. Let us call for the Retailers Association to start holding a series of town halls where everybody can come discuss this, and we can start figuring out what are the different views, who are the stakeholders, can we start defining terms, can we come to some agreement in certain areas, and even if we find areas where we disagree, can we at least define those areas well? In that respect, Target could have acted consistently with its progressive brand, but what it would have been calling for is civil dialogue. And it could have shown leadership without necessarily antagonizing a very large percentage of its customer base.
Right.
And you can think of companies that have taken strong positions on other parts of the political spectrum, and part of what I'm thinking and what I'm advocating is that we try to enhance civil dialogue, which is something that America used to have a genius for. Which is, let's get together, let's talk it through, and let's try and find some compromise. And even if we can't come to a full agreement, at least we will have defined the areas where we agree, we define the areas where we disagree, and we define the areas for further discussion.
Now, it's interesting. In the association, I mean, you're suggesting working through associations or sort of related but separate organizations, nonprofits perhaps. I mean, maybe Target's a good example to follow through. That in that instance, it would the Retailers Association, I suppose. I mean, do you think that there was a significant desire on the part of other retailers to really enter into that pretty hot button environment to have those kind of discussions? I guess the cliche would be it takes two to tango. I mean, do you think there would be other retailing voices that would be interested in that, or who would they be? Who would Target be talking to? I guess is my question.
Well, I think the issue was upon us as a retailer, which is we now have one ordinance in North Carolina. How are people going to respond to it? Are we going to obey the law in North Carolina? Are we going to oppose it? What should our policies be? So the fact is, there is process or there's ethics around deciding what the ethics is. And so in certain new or fast-changing areas, we simply don't know, I'll say as a society, what are the ethics of the situation? And so the analogy I look at is behavioral advertising and internet privacy back in the late 90s, where you had this fabulous new technology. It was very clearly going to become extremely important to the economy. It was going to involve a lot of advertising dollars, and it was going to involve millions and millions and millions of consumers. So what are the right rules around internet privacy and behaviorally targeted ads? And so you had some associations, the Internet Advertising Bureau, for example, which came up with some guidelines. And then the Federal Trade Commission held a series of town halls later just to do this very thing, to get policy dialogue going so people could start understanding how do we define our terms. What is personally identifiable information? What is personal data? What is sensitive data? What is an opt-in versus opt-out? How are we going to define a cookie? These kinds of questions. So I think what Target could have done if it's wanted to maintain, loyalty to it, so to speak, its brand and its culture, would have been to call for dialogue. And it could have done it through the association. And some people would have shown up. I don't know, would necessarily have everyone come? I don't know, but I think it's a safer and wiser course of action in a fast-moving area like this to at least call for dialogue and say, look, we have a position or a view, but what we think collectively is important, and the process by which we arrive at this is important. I think a lot of the resentment was the idea of coercion rather than persuasion.
Right.
And whether somebody is forcing it on somebody else. I certainly think Target would have been much better off by calling for dialogue than by simply making the unilateral decision it made. And in that respect, I can only speculate. I think that they believed that their own view was perhaps more widely held than it was. And they found out to their detriment that perhaps it wasn't. But as much as anything, there wasn't much of a process, an inclusive process for discussion to say, let's at least surface how people think about this.
Well, let me push back on that in a different way. I mean, wouldn't the argument be? I mean, I think we're talking about North Carolina. Wouldn't the argument be that the dialogue, the meaningful dialogue, that sort of took place as part of the North Carolinian political process, wouldn't that be sort of the baseline, which is to say, if the citizens of North Carolina have, through their elected representatives, come to a position, why would a public company like Target go against that? Because the conversation has happened in sort of the rough and tumble of the political process. That's always been some, and I don't mean to pick on Target, and I don't mean to pick on this particular issue. I mean just in general.
Right.
It's because you do wander into these very, very strange areas where Apple again was one of the companies that were threatening all kinds of bad things, with respect to the North Carolina issue, and other observers kind of looked at it and said, well, golly, Apple is doing everything they can do to expand in China in places like that, which are much more draconian in terms of their social policies than North Carolina, and so you end up in this sort of strange cul-de-sac of making decisions on political issues when you're a computer company or when you're a retailer, and I just have a hard time getting my head around that, to be real honest with you.
Well, sometimes it falls on you, and sometimes you intentionally step into it. So in the sense of Target, North Carolina passed its law, and the retailers in North Carolina then had a decision, which is, are we going to intentionally, in a sense, refuse the law? Or the other question is, what are our obligations with regard to enforcement of this law? Okay, somebody goes into the bathroom the law says they shouldn't go into. Are we supposed to set up bathroom police to check everybody before they go in? Or do we seriously? I mean, if you're in charge of operations at Target and security, what are you doing? I'm assuming I talked to some people who worked at Target. Their security people are ordered never to use force to detain anybody because they don't want a lawsuit resulting from it. They also don't want to have any violence in the store if somebody resists arrest. So my sense was North Carolina has its law, but what does Target need to do in terms of compliance? If somebody goes into the wrong bathroom, is Target going to get sued just because somebody went into the wrong bathroom? If somebody complains about another person being in the wrong bathroom, what is security supposed to do? So in that respect, I think that retailers like Target had it fall on them because, one, they had issues around compliance in North Carolina, but then the question was, what are we going to do in other states that haven't yet passed this law? And that's where I feel that having civil policy dialogue is really very appropriate. And I think that Target could have shown leadership simply by calling for the dialogue and saying, look, we don't have all the answers, but we think it's important that the industry start to define what the set of answers might be and understand how people feel about them. Now, you have other cases, more recently, I think, with a company like Starbucks, where the CEO came out, with a certain policy in terms of hiring refugees and recent immigrants.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so the question is, okay, why? Now, in some respects, Starbucks might say, look, we're a Seattle company. This is our mission. Here are our values. Here is our brand. We're going to act in accordance with this. The way it came out was almost in defiance of the president's policy. And people might or might not like the president's policy, but it came out almost as an act of defiance. And the question I would raise is it in your shareholders' interests to come out with that in this fashion?
Yeah.
And
that's actually
not, why are you doing it?
It's another very interesting question. How do the shareholders, and this actually leads to a much broader conversation in terms of the power or lack thereof of ordinary shareholders. But where do the shareholders fit into all this? Because I think that's an interesting thing too. Because as you say, I mean, if Target or Starbucks, I think it's undeniable. Starbucks has a progressive brand. I mean, they're, as you say, they're Seattle-based. They're hip, right? They're progressive. And my guess is a large portion of their consumer base is equally progressive. But it's just interesting to me the voice of the shareholder. I mean, are these things? I guess I'll ask the question: are these things decided typically at a board level, or are they typically decided at the operational level, CEO and below? Under the theory that it's the board that ultimately represents the shareholders. I always wonder how often they have a say in these things.
Well, the board represents the interests of the companies, and then depending on state law, there's some rules about whether, in a sense, they're representing the shareholders as a class. But I think to answer your question more practically, the board's role in corporate governance is to guide the formulation of strategy, to select and monitor and advise the CEO and the senior management team. So the board's not supposed to be, so to speak, running the company. Right. The practical answer, I think, is that the board should be involved in guiding and monitoring the CEO in terms of the definition of the company's mission, its values, its culture, and its brand. And those items need to be interlocking and coherent. They need to be supporting one another. And then the board needs to have an understanding with the CEO, okay, how do you intend to promote the brand in a way that's consistent with these other items that we've seen you and we've put forward and we've discussed with you. And I think that, a question I think probably at the next quarterly board meeting of Starbucks may well be, or at Target, which is, why did you say this? How is it consistent? How is it in the best interest of the company? You have a brand that takes you in a certain direction. I've given one option for a progressive company, which is call for dialogue, call for civil dialogue. You don't have to plant a flag somewhere out exposed in the middle of nowhere. What I suspect the issue with some of these progressive companies, it can happen to so-called conservative companies as well, is the senior management is all of one mind, and they tend to think that their position is more universal than it may actually be. And they might not be hearing the counter arguments. And I don't know if they're gathering the data to say, well, actually, 35% of our customers feel strongly the other way. So I think the board has a definite role in making sure that mission, values, culture, and brand are all aligned and mutually supporting. And then, as Steve Wynn said, it's the CEO's job to drive the culture. And in driving the culture, he should also be forwarding the brand. But those are the things that the board should be guiding him on, and that the board should be understanding, okay, how are you going to drive it? How are you going to promote the brand? And how are we going to measure your success so that we know that you're doing the job that we've hired you to do?
It occurs to me, these kind of things, and I hadn't really thought about this before, these kind of things along the lines of what we're just talking about, these kind of things could actually be a means to really get a grasp of your actual engagement with your customers, to a certain extent. I mean, asking your customers may be the best route, if you know what I mean, right? I mean, because a place like Starbucks, a place like Target, and on the other side of the spectrum, places like Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby. Right. I mean, asking your customers is the right thing to do, because that way at least you're engaged, and as opposed to stamping a flag in the ground, and then you can report those, and you can sort of become your own barometer of at least your customers' perspective on these kind of issues. Actually, that's not a bad marketing ploy. Actually, now that I think about it, not to be too cynical, but
well, with the exception of Don Rickles, few people have done well in business by insulting their customers. Right, and so I think trying to get a handle on how your customers are thinking, whom you're appealing to, what are the segments that you're going after, I think are critical. Again, you don't always have to do anything. Sometimes doing nothing is the right answer. Right. Which is, let's just let this thing develop. Why do we have to involve ourselves unnecessarily? And that's where I kind of scratch my head at some recent things. I have a friend who's SVP for diversity and inclusion of a publicly traded tech company, and he came out with a public statement on Twitter with respect to the administration's decision on guidance through the Department of Education on changing rooms and bathrooms in high schools.
Right.
And let's assume that the guidance that was changed was done mistakenly or wrongly. I'll grant that. Why does a publicly traded technology company need to weigh in on this? How is it in the interest of its own shareholders?
Right.
And this is where I raise the question of if a professional manager of a company with a diverse shareholder group starts weighing in like this, is he improperly, in a sense, using his forum and using the resources of the company to promote a position which is really close to his heart, but is not necessarily relevant to the company's operations and doesn't necessarily represent an appropriate cross-section of the shareholders? So in this, we mentioned Hobby Lobby, and one reason I love this case and why I teach it in my ethics class is the conservative and liberal justices, in a sense, have flipped and made arguments which are the opposite of what you would ordinarily expect. So you have the so-called conservative wing, which is saying a corporation, well, it's just a form of collective action by individuals. So kumbaya, it's all just a bunch of people getting together to do the right thing. And then you have the liberal wing, and this is Justice Ginsburg quoting Justice Stevens, who says very vehemently, corporations have no consciences, no beliefs, no feelings, no thoughts, no desires.
Right.
If you take that logic out, what you're basically saying is a corporation can't be ethical. Because if you have no conscience, no beliefs, no feelings, no thoughts, and no desires, I'm not sure you have the moral wherewithal to act ethically. What that means is, are the people within your company acting ethically?
Right.
Which is a different question. And
well,
so
and there you get into the public-private question. I think my own take on that, because I think the argument that a corporation can be amoral, not immoral but amoral, makes a little bit more sense in the public realm. But I'm a private business owner. I have been for 30 years. And the truth of the matter is, as a private business owner, I do want my values to be reflected in what I do, not to the extent that I'm preaching at anybody or anything like that, but as you say, be ethical. I mean, I think Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby are really good examples of that, in that they're privately owned. They have their owners have an ethos which they are not shy about, and whether you agree with them or not, they're still producing their product. They're not trying to beat people over the head with it, but they, as the owners of a private company, in my mind, they do have the agency, as it were, to determine those kind of issues. We're not going to open on Sundays, as an example, of Chick-fil-A, because of religious reasons. Whereas, to me, there's a distinction between that and a private company which is owned by the public. Sorry, a public company which is owned by, it's not owned by a private individual. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
You have Supreme Court precedent on your side. In other words, if you look at the Hobby Lobby case, the conservative majority and the liberal minority, if we're going to use some gross labels, are really not that far apart, because what they're focused on essentially is how close and how coherent is the ownership group. And so what the conservative majority said was, we have a very tight ownership group. It's privately held. It's within the family. They all feel the same way. And in that respect, it's faith through action, and that is that they are expressing their religious faith through how they conduct themselves in the public sphere, including in the commercial sphere. And Ginsburg talks about why shouldn't a private enterprise be considered to exercise religion when we would recognize that a nonprofit organization well might. And she says, well, the reason is hardly obscure, which is code for I'm going to give you something I can't justify. And what she says is that religious organizations exist to foster the interest of persons subscribing to the same religious faith. So in a sense, that's a tightness and coherence argument about religious organizations. Now, I happen to believe that's not true, because if you look at St. Teresa of Calcutta's Sisters of Mercy, they were not existing to provide care to Catholics. You have interfaith groups that exist to serve people of various faiths. You have a group that's Catholics for Animals, who are out there to minister to animals in the physical sense, obviously.
Even just Catholic Charities, basically. I mean, they don't check your religion when they provide services to you. That's exactly right.
Right. Also, you say, well, they're just doing that to seek converts. The fact is, how do you explain Catholics for Animals then? Because they're not seeking to convert the animals. Right? St. Francis Assisi already did that, as far as I know, at least in Italy. So I think this distinction is really around the tightness and coherence of the ownership group, because you could imagine a private company. I use an example in my class of the Widget family, where I have one brother. He owns the company entirely, and he's just decided he's going to give his extra profits to the church. And then he ends up with a brother. They're equal partners, and half goes to the church and half goes to the Sierra Club. It's still not much of a problem. But then what happens is you start getting some cousins who aren't actively working in the business. They're not drawing salaries. They don't have company cars. And they're saying, wait a second, we'd like some of those profits, please. And so it doesn't take much diversity within even a privately held company to start saying, wait a second, are we seeing ethical behavior, or what we're seeing is really self-dealing? So there's a famous case of the Dodge brothers against Henry Ford, where they wanted Henry Ford to start paying some dividends. And he was saying, no, I want to keep prices low, I want to keep salaries high, and the Dodge brothers prevailed. So I think I would say that the distinction is not just sort of public-private, it's really more closely held, very coherent, very homogeneous in outlook. In that case, 100% agree with you. That, to my mind, is a rare beast, which is it's an ethical business or an ethical organization. In most cases in business, you're dealing with ownership groups that are diverse enough that I would argue that you're not really thinking about this as a company, as an organization which is ethical. The question is, are the people within it acting ethically? And part of ethical behavior on the part of a manager is not to substitute your good for that of the shareholders. And if you go too far afield in some of these social or political areas, I begin to wonder if that's what's not happening, and that's a problem.
Be sure to check back for future episodes of the President and CEO Focus on the Middle Market podcast series. Thanks for listening.